At night, a bell rang in Nuremberg, but no one pulled the rope. After its sound, a sweet, rotting smell crept into homes, and by morning entire families were found sitting at their tables, upright, calm, eyes open, as if waiting for permission to stop breathing. The city tried to silence the bell, bury it, erase it, but something worse happened. Chairs began to move on their own. People sat down without fear. And when the ringing finally stopped, no one was dead. Because the bell was never calling people to die. It was teaching the city how to listen. The bell rang when no hands touched it, and the city felt the sound before it heard it. It slid through the narrow streets of Nuremberg like a dull blade drawn slowly from its sheath, scraping stone, sinking into timber, vibrating through shutters, bones, and teeth. It was not loud in the way of celebration or warning. It was heavy. It carried weight. The air reacted first, thickening, pressing back against the lungs, as if the night itself had learned how to breathe and was testing its strength. Windows began to sweat almost immediately, beads of moisture crawling down the glass, carrying with them a sour, sweet stench that seeped into rooms and bedding. The smell clung to the tongue, halfway between rotting fruit and old blood left too long in iron bowls. Inside the houses, candles trembled though no wind moved. Dogs whimpered and buried themselves beneath benches. Infants stopped crying all at once, their breath catching as if held by an unseen hand. The sound did not pass quickly. It lingered, stretching itself thin, vibrating in the walls long after the bronze throat of the bell should have gone silent. Those who lay awake felt it settle behind the eyes, a pressure that encouraged stillness, patience, listening. By morning, the city discovered what the night had arranged. Doors stood closed and unforced. Bread remained on boards, half cut. Bowls of stew had skinned over in the open air. Chairs were drawn close to tables with careful precision, legs aligned, seats squared. Families were found seated upright, back straight, hands folded or resting neatly in laps. Their eyes remained open, fixed on nothing, mouths relaxed, faces emptied of fear and pain. They looked as if they were waiting for something that had been promised and delayed. No wounds marked the bodies. No signs of struggle disturbed the rooms. Even the rats stayed away, lingering at thresholds as if unwilling to cross into spaces claimed by something else. When the city clerks arrived, they wrote slowly, carefully, their quills scratching with restraint. They avoided certain words. They described positions, postures, arrangements. They did not speculate. Ink blotted where hands shook. The bell itself hung unchanged in the tower, dark with age, its bronze skin mottled and dull. It had been cast long before, poured from melted offerings, coins, and vessels that had once touched the lips of the faithful and the dying alike. Some claimed the metal had never cooled properly. Others whispered that it remembered every hand that had fed it into the fire. As the sun rose higher, the smell faded from the streets but lingered in fabric and hair. Those who had survived moved quietly, instinctively lowering their voices, careful not to disturb the shape the night had left behind. Above them, the tower stood patient and still, and the bell waited without swinging, as if listening for the city to settle back into place before deciding when to breathe again. Records from the city clerks spoke carefully, as if ink itself were afraid of what it might preserve. The pages from those months carried a strange restraint, lines pressed thin, letters tightened, margins left unusually wide. The clerks described absences rather than deaths, arrangements rather than violence. They noted doors found sealed from within, locks untouched, windows barred against a night that had never asked permission to enter. They recorded bread still warm on the boards, stew cooling in uncovered bowls, candles burned low but not spent, as though time itself had paused in deference to something passing through. Each entry followed the same rhythm. Household, number of occupants, condition of room, position of bodies, no mention of blood, no mention of wounds. The word plague appeared rarely and only as a reference point, a past calamity invoked to explain why the bell existed at all. That omission mattered. The clerks knew the difference between sickness and arrangement, between death and compliance, and their hands betrayed that knowledge with every measured stroke. The bell's history was recorded elsewhere, in older volumes kept in the lowest shelves of the archive, where the air smelled of dust and cold stone. It had been cast decades earlier, during the first great waves of pestilence that hollowed the city from the inside. The bronze had come from melted church vessels, censers, chalices, candlesticks, scraped together in desperation. Coins were added as well, pried from the stiff fingers of the dead when there were no living hands left to claim them. The metal was never meant for beauty. It was meant for endurance, for volume, for authority. The bell was raised not to mark hours, but to mark presence, to declare that the city still existed even as it emptied. Some records suggested the bell had been rung constantly in those early years, day and night, until the sound became indistinguishable from the air itself. Others claimed it rang only when carts passed through the gates carrying bodies stacked like lumber, faces hidden beneath cloth already stiff with use. The disagreement was never resolved, but all versions agreed on one detail: the bell outlasted the plague. It remained when the fever burned itself out, when grass grew again between stones, when merchants returned and children were born who did not remember the sound. What no record addressed directly was the change. Somewhere between salvation and habit, the bell became something else. The bronze darkened unevenly, developing a dull sheen that resisted polishing. The clapper wore its groove deeper than expected, as if it had struck more often than accounted for. When storms rolled through, lightning bent away from the tower, skirting its height without touching it. These details appeared only in marginal notes, written by hands less disciplined, quickly crossed out or left unsigned. The animals noticed first. Dogs hid beneath benches and wagons hours before the bell rang, whining at nothing, refusing food. Horses reared and broke tethers without cause, their eyes rolling white as they strained toward open ground. Rats vanished entirely from certain districts, leaving behind gnawed wood and abandoned nests as if they had evacuated under orders. This happened not during the sound, but before it, long before, as if the earth itself had delivered a warning too low for human ears. The clerks recorded these observations reluctantly, often attributing them to coincidence or weather, though no storms followed. They preferred tangible details, the kind that could be measured and cataloged. Temperature, smell, duration. The smell appeared again and again in their notes, described differently each time, but always with hesitation. Sweet at first, then cloying, then metallic. It clung to fabric, to hair, to the inside of the nose, and lingered long after the air cleared. Some claimed it came from the river. Others blamed spoiled grain. None explained why it followed the sound and not the season. As disappearances continued, the archive grew heavier. Pages accumulated faster than bindings could contain them. The clerks began cross-referencing entries, drawing lines between households that shared no blood, no trade, no proximity. Patterns emerged that made no sense on a map. Entire streets were spared while isolated houses vanished intact. In some cases, the bell rang and nothing happened at all. In others, it rang softly and took everything. The bell itself was examined under council order. Craftsmen climbed the tower in daylight, ropes creaking, boots scraping stone. They reported no cracks, no damage, no signs of forced movement. The clapper hung still, cold to the touch. When struck by hand, the sound rang true, ordinary, obedient. Yet none of them would meet each other's eyes afterward, and each washed their hands repeatedly before descending, as if bronze dust had worked its way beneath the skin. At night, the city listened. People learned the difference between the bell rung by men and the bell that rang alone. The former announced itself cleanly, predictably, followed by the echo of ropes and human movement. The latter arrived without preparation. It slid into the streets already complete, heavy and dull, as though it had been sounding somewhere else long before it reached the tower. The clerks did not write that last part. They confined themselves to facts, to objects left behind, to rooms arranged with impossible care. They noted that families were found seated, never collapsed, never sprawled. They noted the absence of struggle, the lack of disruption. They noted that in every case, the bodies faced inward, toward tables, toward one another, toward a center that no longer required explanation. As the records accumulated, the ink darkened, soaking deeper into the page. The margins filled with corrections, additions, symbols that belonged to no accounting system taught in the city schools. The bell continued to hang above it all, silent by day, patient by night, carrying within its bronze the memory of every offering, every coin, every vessel that had once promised protection and instead learned how to wait. The order came at dawn, carried through the council chamber in voices stripped of argument. The bell would be restrained. Its mouth would be closed, its voice smothered, its authority reduced to weight and silence. Thick cloth was hauled up the tower, layer upon layer, wrapped tightly around the bronze throat until its surface disappeared beneath binding and knots. Iron clasps were bolted shut with deliberate force, metal shrieking briefly as it was tightened, as if protesting the intimacy. Guards were stationed beneath the tower, for at first, then 8, instructed to watch the ropes, the pulleys, the floor, the air itself if necessary. No one spoke of trust. No one spoke of fear. The language was practical, administrative, as though sound could be governed by decree. Throughout the day, citizens passed the tower more slowly than usual. They looked up, noting the absence of bronze, the unnatural bulk where the bell's curve should have been. The cloth drank the light, dull and heavy, swallowing reflections. Children were pulled along by the wrist. Merchants lowered their voices without realizing they had done so. The air around the tower felt denser, as if pressure had gathered there and refused to disperse. By evening, the guards had stopped speaking to one another. They stood in careful formation, back straight, eyes forward, listening for a sound they insisted could no longer exist. The ropes creaked softly as the tower cooled. The city settled into itself with the brittle calm of something holding its breath. The bell rang anyway. It did not announce itself from above. There was no echo thrown outward from the tower, no ripple of sound traveling street by street. Instead, it arrived already inside the city, low and intimate, as if it had always been there and simply chosen that moment to be noticed. The vibration bloomed behind the eyes, inside the chest, along the spine. People felt it through their beds, through their chairs, through the soles of their feet. It carried none of the brightness of metal struck cleanly. It was muffled, thick, intimate, a sound pressed close to the body. The smell followed immediately. It seeped through walls as if they were porous, through shutters and mortar and locked doors. At first it was sweet, almost comforting, like fruit left too long in a warm cellar. Then it grew heavier, cloying, pressing into the throat and sinuses. Finally it turned unmistakably nauseating, metallic and wet, a smell that suggested iron soaked in sugar, flesh prepared carefully for preservation rather than decay. Lungs resisted it, then surrendered, drawing it deeper with every breath. Candles dimmed without extinguishing. The flames shortened, bent inward, casting shadows that clung too tightly to corners and furniture. People lay awake, or sat upright without knowing why, their bodies responding before thought had time to intervene. The sound did not fade. It did not swell. It held, a constant presence, a pressure rather than a noise. Dreams took hold where sleep was allowed. Long tables stretched through unfamiliar halls, polished and unblemished, extending beyond sight. Everyone sat perfectly still, hands placed with careful symmetry, faces calm and attentive. No one spoke. No one needed to. At the head of each table stood an empty chair, larger than the others, its surface unmarked, waiting with a patience that felt infinite. The dreamers sensed that the chair was not vacant, only unoccupied, and that its occupant would arrive when the arrangement was complete. Beneath the tower, the guards did not move. Those watching from nearby windows later swore the men had stood at attention long past the moment when the sound should have driven them to cover their ears. When dawn came, the guards were still there, their boots aligned, their helmets placed neatly at their feet. Their eyes were open, their mouths were parted slightly, as if listening to something too faint for anyone else to hear. The cloth around the bell hung undisturbed. The iron clasps remained tight. Nothing had swung. Nothing had struck. The council convened again in silence. No one asked how the bell had rung. The question itself felt inappropriate, childish, as if it misunderstood the nature of what had occurred. Instead, They spoke of reinforcement. More cloth, thicker bindings, additional guards. They spoke of relocation, of removal, of burial if necessary. Each proposal carried an unspoken recognition that the bell was no longer fully subject to location. Across the city, people found themselves rearranging their homes without conscious intent. Chairs were pulled closer to tables. Extra places were cleared. Utensils were set aside carefully, polished, aligned. Families lingered longer at meals, eating slowly, listening between bites. Even those who had slept poorly felt an unfamiliar calm settle over them, a sense of having been acknowledged. The smell lingered well into the morning, clinging to clothing and hair, embedded in wood and fabric. It followed people into the streets, into workshops and chapels, faint but persistent. Those who noticed it found themselves slowing their steps, counting unconsciously, measuring space and distance with unusual care. Above it all, the tower stood unchanged. The bell remained bound, silent by any measure that could be recorded. Yet the city had learned something that night, though no one could have named it aloud. The sound no longer required permission. The bell did not need air, or motion, or metal against metal. It had learned how to ring through presence alone, how to place itself inside the body, inside the room, inside the thought. And somewhere beneath the bindings, beneath the cloth and iron, the bronze waited, not straining, not resisting, but listening closely, as if gauging how well the city had heard it this time. The guards were discovered after sunrise, when the light had softened enough to make the scene appear almost deliberate. They sat beneath the tower in a perfect circle, evenly spaced, back straight, knees bent at matching angles. Their helmets rested at their feet, aligned with care, leather straps tucked neatly beneath polished rims. Nothing in their posture suggested collapse or surprise. They looked arranged, not fallen, as if they had taken their places willingly and agreed not to move again. Their skin had changed. It carried a faint bronze sheen, subtle enough to be mistaken for reflected light at first, but too uniform to dismiss. It dulled the natural variation of flesh, smoothing it into something closer to metal left too long in open air. Their mouths were parted just enough to suggest listening, not speaking, not gasping. Their eyes remained open, unfocused, reflecting the tower above them without recognition. Those who stood nearest felt the air tighten. Sound behaved strangely there, footsteps landing too softly, voices muffled as if absorbed by the stone. The smell returned faintly, sweet and metallic, clinging to the space between bodies. No insects approached. Birds avoided the square entirely, circling wide before settling elsewhere. The tower loomed unchanged, its shadow falling directly into the center of the circle, as though it had been measured. The bound bell remained hidden above, wrapped and restrained, its presence implied only by weight and memory. No rope hung slack, no clasp lay disturbed. The silence beneath it felt intentional, held in place rather than empty. City officials arrived slowly, accompanied by clerks who carried their ledgers like shields. None crossed into the circle. They counted the guards twice without stepping closer, their eyes tracing the arrangement with unease. 8 men. Then again, 8. The number settled without comfort. The bodies were removed only after long hesitation. When they were lifted, they resisted slightly, not through stiffness but through balance, as if the arrangement itself objected to being disturbed. The stone beneath them was warm to the touch, retaining a heat that did not belong to the morning. No marks remained once they were gone, no outlines, no stains, only a faint discoloration that faded as the sun climbed higher. The archives received the report before the bodies were fully prepared for burial. The clerks wrote with unusual precision, describing angles, distances, placement. They avoided interpretation. They avoided motive. They avoided the bell entirely, as if naming it might draw attention. Days later, a marginal note appeared in one of the volumes. It occupied the narrow space beside an otherwise ordinary entry, written smaller than the surrounding text, precise and confident. The hand did not belong to any scribe known to the archive. It carried none of the familiar flourishes or corrections. The ink matched perfectly, neither fresher nor older than the rest of the page. The note stated that the bell had always rung for those already counted, and that resistance only clarified the count. No clerk admitted to writing it. No one claimed to have seen it appear. The page showed no signs of having been handled recently, no smudges, no new impressions. Yet the note sat there with certainty, as if it had always been waiting for the correct moment to be read. The meaning unsettled those who considered it. The phrase already counted suggested a process that preceded sound, action, even awareness. It implied that the bell did not select, but confirmed, that the ringing was not a summons, but a recognition. Resistance, then, was not defiance, but participation, a movement that sharpened definition rather than altering outcome. The council ordered the note copied and then quietly removed from the volume. The original page was replaced. The margin left blank. Yet the sentence reappeared days later, written again in a different ledger, beside an unrelated entry. Then again, always in the margins. Always the same wording. Always the same hand. Clerks began to dread turning pages. They read more slowly, tracing lines with their fingers, checking margins before continuing. Some pages felt heavier than others. Some resisted being turned, clinging faintly to the fingers as if reluctant to reveal themselves. Outside the archive, the city adjusted without announcement. Guards were reassigned, but no one volunteered for duty beneath the tower. Citizens avoided the square, skirting its edges, lowering their eyes as they passed. Children were warned away with stories that felt too careful to be invented. At night, people dreamed less. Or rather, they dreamed without images, waking with the sensation of having been observed rather than entertained. Tables appeared in memory without context. Chairs aligned themselves in the mind, unbidden. The empty place returned again and again, not as a threat, but as a certainty. The smell faded from the streets but lingered in enclosed spaces, surfacing unexpectedly in cellars and storerooms. Those who noticed it found themselves pausing mid-task, hands hovering, listening for something they could not hear. The bell did not ring. It did not need to. The guards were buried with ceremony, their armor cleaned, their faces arranged. The bronze sheen dulled slowly beneath soil and cloth, resisting decay longer than expected. Gravediggers spoke of warmth beneath their hands even as the earth cooled around them. In the archive, the marginal notes continued to appear, uninvited and unaltered. Attempts to erase them failed. Ink bled through scraped parchment. Pages torn out reappeared bound elsewhere, the sentence intact. The clerks stopped trying to remove them. They began instead to leave space. Understanding crept through the city like damp through stone. The bell was not an object to be controlled, nor a voice to be silenced. It was a measure. It marked those who had already been aligned, already arranged, already seated in some unseen order. The ringing was merely the moment of recognition, the sound of the count being read aloud. Beneath the tower, the space where the guards had sat remained undisturbed. No one crossed it. No one cleaned it. It felt occupied without being filled, held in readiness. The city moved around it carefully, instinctively preserving the circle, as if to disturb it would invite the bell to clarify the count once more. The city attempted erasure with the quiet urgency of people who no longer believed in correction, only in removal. The decision was made before sunrise, when the streets still belonged to fog and refuse, and the tower loomed without witnesses. Ropes were hauled into place by men who avoided looking upward for too long. They worked in silence, their hands raw, their movements careful, as though the bell might feel impatience if rushed. When the bindings were loosened and the bronze began to descend, the ropes frayed as they slid, fibers tearing with soft, wet sounds that made several men recoil. No one spoke of replacing them. The bell came down slowly, swaying only once, enough to draw a sharp intake of breath from those watching. The bronze looked darker at ground level, its surface uneven, dulled by age and something else that resisted description. Lime was poured into a pit beyond the city walls, white dust rising into the air and coating boots and hems. Prayers were spoken without conviction, recited from memory rather than belief, their words drifting and dispersing before they reached any intended listener. The bell was lowered into the pit with care bordering on reverence, not out of respect, but out of caution. When the earth closed over it, The sound of shovels striking soil felt final in a way the ringing never had. The tower stood empty after that, its height stripped of purpose. For a season, it remained silent. The air around it felt lighter. People walked beneath it without stopping. Merchants raised their voices again. Children played closer to the square. The archive received fewer entries. The clerks slept more easily, though some reported waking with the impression that something had been interrupted rather than concluded. Weeks passed without incident. No chairs moved on their own. No tables aligned themselves overnight. The smell receded from fabric and wood, lingering only faintly in forgotten corners. Rats returned cautiously. Dogs resumed barking at ordinary threats. The city allowed itself a measured optimism, careful not to name relief outright, as if doing so might be overheard. Then, on a night without wind, the smell returned. It did not announce itself with sound. It rose instead from below, drifting up from cellars and wells, seeping through stone and mortar with patient insistence. It was fainter than before, thinner, but unmistakable. Sweet at first, then heavy, then metallic, it clung low to the ground, pooling in narrow streets and enclosed rooms. People woke with it already in their lungs, tasting it on their tongues before they could place its origin. No bell rang. The tower remained silent. Yet the absence of sound did nothing to stop what followed. Families began to sit closer together without understanding why. Meals stretched longer. Chairs were pulled inward by inches, then by hands that did not recall moving. Extra places were cleared and left open. People lingered at tables long after plates were empty, reluctant to stand, reluctant to break the arrangement. Children were corrected sharply when they fidgeted or shifted, the reprimands automatic and unreasoned. In some houses, furniture was rearranged entirely. Tables were turned to face walls that had never been significant before. Benches were brought in from workshops and aligned carefully along their length. The changes were small enough to escape immediate notice, but consistent enough to unsettle those who paused to look. The smell appeared again and again, always on nights without wind, never accompanied by sound. It drifted up from wells where buckets came up damp and smelling faintly of iron. It crept through cellar doors, settling around barrels and sacks. People sealed cracks and stuffed cloth into gaps, but the scent ignored boundaries. It was not carried by air alone. Those who tried to leave the city for a night or two found themselves restless, unable to sleep away from their own tables, their own chairs. Some returned early, citing unfinished work or sudden illness. Others stayed away longer and came back quieter, their movements more deliberate, their homes rearranged within days of their return. Beyond the walls, the burial site remained undisturbed. Grass refused to grow properly there, sprouting thin and pale before withering again. Animals avoided the area, circling wide as they passed. Those assigned to guard the perimeter changed often, citing discomfort they could not explain. At night, the ground retained warmth longer than it should have, releasing it slowly into the air. In the city, the archive received new kinds of entries. Not disappearances, not deaths, but observations. Households requesting additional chairs. Merchants noting customers who lingered without purchasing. Clerks writing of nights spent seated without fatigue, aware of time passing but unwilling to stand. The margins of these pages remained blank, though some claimed to see faint impressions there, as if words had been written and erased before ink could settle. The tower was inspected again. Its emptiness felt deliberate, preserved. No one suggested hanging a new bell. The space where the old one had rested seemed occupied by memory alone, heavy with expectation. Sound behaved differently around it, footsteps echoing too long, voices flattening as they rose. People began to speak of waiting without agreeing on what was awaited. The word entered conversation carefully, applied to unrelated things. Waiting for weather, waiting for news, waiting for a sense of completion. It became easier to remain seated than to rise, easier to listen than to speak. The smell grew less frequent, but more precise. It appeared in specific houses, specific rooms, never randomly. Those affected did not panic. They adjusted. Chairs were placed with more care. Tables were cleared thoroughly. Hands folded themselves naturally when resting. The arrangements felt correct, inevitable, as if remembered rather than invented. At night, Dreams returned, quieter than before. No long halls this time, no endless tables. Just rooms as they were, familiar and exact, with everyone seated properly, breathing evenly, aware of one another's presence. The empty place remained, not ominous, simply reserved. The city understood, slowly and unwillingly, that burial had not been an ending. The bell had not been removed so much as redistributed, its function no longer tied to bronze or height or sound. It had learned the shape of the city, the habits of its people, the spaces they returned to night after night. The waiting had not ended. It had only become more intimate. And in the silence where the bell once hung, the tower stood patient, marking nothing aloud, while beneath the streets and within the houses, the city arranged itself, rehearsing carefully for a recognition that no longer required a ringing to be complete. Years later, when plague no longer ruled the city and its memory had thinned into ink and superstition, Nuremberg allowed itself a ceremony. Children had grown who had never smelled the sweetness beneath the sickness. Stone had been replaced, beams renewed, graves walked over without pause. The tower still stood empty, its silence no longer feared but regarded as unfinished. Absence, after all, invited completion. The council approved a new bell, cast not from relics or desperation, but from clean bronze, newly smelted, unburdened by memory. The metal rang true when tested on the ground, bright and obedient, a sound that belonged to the present rather than the past. The bell was raised with celebration restrained by instinct. No prayers accompanied it, only measurements and procedure. It hung perfectly centered, balanced with care, its surface polished until it reflected the sky in soft, distorted curves. For the first time in years, the tower felt occupied rather than haunted, filled rather than hollow. People passed beneath it without slowing. Some even looked up and smiled, surprised by their own lack of hesitation. The test was scheduled for night, out of respect for custom, though no one could recall who had established that rule. Citizens gathered indoors, not from fear but from habit, sitting near windows, standing in doorways, aware of the moment's approach without anticipating consequence. The air was still. Wells lay dark and quiet. Cellars held their breath. When the time came, the rope was pulled. The bell did not ring. No sound came from the tower at all. The rope moved. The mechanism responded, but the bronze remained silent, as though it had forgotten its purpose. There was no echo, no vibration, no resistance. For a brief moment, confusion rippled through the city, a collective pause filled with the faint expectation of correction. Instead, chairs began to move. The sound was soft at first, barely audible, a dry scraping against stone and wood. It came not from one place, but from everywhere at once. In houses, in workshops, in taverns long closed for the night, chairs shifted inward, legs dragging across floors with careful precision. Benches adjusted themselves. Stools turned. Furniture aligned not toward tables, but toward the tower, each piece orienting with subtle confidence. People followed without panic. Bodies responded before thought could interfere. Knees bent, spines straightened. Hands found their places naturally, resting on thighs, folding loosely, touching the edge of a table for balance. The movement was synchronized not by command, but by recognition, a shared relief that required no explanation. Across the city, people sat down at once, as if arriving after a long journey whose length they had never been able to measure. Windows fogged gently, not with condensation, but with breath held evenly. The air carried no sweetness now, no metallic bite. It felt neutral, complete. Outside, the streets lay empty, chairs visible through glass and open doors, all facing inward, all attentive. The tower remained silent. The new bell hung motionless, obedient and unused, its clean bronze reflecting nothing of what unfolded below. It had been made correctly. That was its failing. It belonged to sound, to announcement, to division between before and after. The city no longer required that distinction. Beneath the streets, far beyond wells and foundations, the buried bell answered. The response was not a sound that traveled upward, but a pressure that moved outward, a single, muffled pulse that passed through soil and stone and bone. It was deep and satisfied, complete in itself, like the final placement of a piece long held aside. Those seated felt it not as vibration, but as release, a loosening behind the eyes, a quiet settling in the chest. There were no deaths that night, no bodies to count, no archives to update. The city breathed evenly, collectively, present in a way it had never managed before. The waiting, which had shaped generations without ever naming itself, ended not with collapse or silence, but with arrival. People understood then, without words, that the bell had never been about plague. Death had only provided the language necessary to begin the lesson. The ringing had not summoned souls away, but aligned them, taught them how to sit, how to listen, how to be counted without fear. Resistance had only sharpened the edges. Compliance had never meant obedience, only attention. Morning came gently. People rose when they were ready. Chairs remained where they had settled, angled subtly toward the tower, a preference rather than a command. The city resumed movement, slower now, more deliberate. No one spoke of the night openly, but no one denied it either. The archive remained quiet, its margins empty at last, their purpose fulfilled. The new bell was never rung. It hung as a marker of transition, a symbol of something outgrown. Children were told it was decorative. Visitors were told it honored tradition. Both statements were true enough. Below, the old bell rested, surrounded by lime and earth, its work complete. It did not ring again. It did not need to. The city had learned how to listen without sound, how to arrange itself without instruction, how to be present without being summoned. Nuremberg continued, altered but intact, a city that had once been counted and now counted itself, not by loss, but by attention. And though no one would have admitted it aloud, there was a shared understanding that if the chairs ever moved again, it would not be to announce an ending, but to mark another moment of collective listening, patient and exact, when the city chose once more to hear what it had always been saying to itself.